Dan, it's great to see you. I'm a huge fan and I've been looking forward to talking to you about finished and unfinished. And so, my first question for you is cash, finished or unfinished?
Well, Darren, it's also a pleasure for me to be on this program with you. I've been looking forward to it as well. So let's see, cash. All right, I'm going to say finished, but I will say this. A lot of people have been predicting the demise of cash, and they've always been wrong. But here's what's happening. Clearly, the amount of payments going through cash is going down in terms of the overall percentage. And the pandemic has accelerated that by multiple years. I mean, people don't want to touch cash anymore. They're afraid that it's carrying germs. Something like 40% of the country says they don't want to handle cash going forward. So you're seeing an explosion in digital payments across the country and frankly across the world. And now you've got governments that are thinking about maybe central banks ought to be issuing digital currencies going forward because it can be more inclusive, it can be more efficient, it can be safer and more secure. So I'm going to say finished, but it'll take a little bit of time. All right, so now I'm going to turn it onto you, Darren, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. So, Darren, the American dream, finished or unfinished?
The American dream is unfinished. I am a believer in this dream. I am a believer in the mobility escalator that made my journey possible. But I must tell you, Dan, I am worried about the American dream, that it is possibly headed for the finish line, that we will live in a country where there is so much inequality that it is not possible to live the American dream. So I don't want to give up on it just yet. So it is unfinished.
So, Darren, I've also been thinking a lot about the American dream, and I would agree with you that it's unfinished. And I think it's so critical. But there are a couple of facts that worry me as well. This is the first generation ever that actually thinks that their lives are not going to be better than their parents. And the reason they think that is they're struggling in so many ways. They're struggling financially. Two-thirds of the country struggle to make ends meet at the end of the month. And think about that in terms of like our democracy. Our democracy requires that people rise above their own self-interest. But how are you going to do that when every single month you are struggling to make ends meet? It's hard to think about your dream going forward. And so I fully agree with you. I think this is an incredibly important unfinished part of our lives, of our economy, of our democracy. But we have got to double down and somehow figure out how to restore that American dream.
You are spot on, Dan. I could not agree more. Now, let me ask you, Dan, Main Street, finished or unfinished?
So I got to say on that, unfinished. I have to. Although there are worrisome signs about Main Street as well. Look, small businesses are the backbone of our communities and our neighborhoods. I mean, they have the vast majority of the shops in our towns, the vast majority of employment in our towns, but they are under a huge amount of pressure right now. They've always been under a lot of pressure, but the pandemic has really exposed the problem with small businesses is that they have something like 20 days of free cash flow, before they go out of business. And so when you have something like the pandemic just barrel down on small businesses, you're seeing so many of them living day to day in a very precarious state or going out of business. And this has disproportionately affected the Black community. Black business owners are going out of business twice as frequently as white owners of small businesses are. They're having a hard time getting loans. And so I think you've got one, an economic crisis hitting Main Street. Number two, you've got this huge shift in models happening where the entire world is moving into a digital economy. And that is so different than Main Street, just bringing people in from the street. Now it's about opening the world to your business. And that involves new skill sets and ways of adapting. And so I think Main Street will need to adapt, but I think it is a critical part of our infrastructure as a community and as neighborhoods.
But don't you also just feel viscerally that America without Main Street is a desolate, depressing, demoralizing country?
I totally agree with that. I think to just have a couple of digital giants or large companies and not have the diversity and the beauty of what is Main Street would take away so much from our lives. All right, I think maybe it's my turn now to go to you, Darren. So I've got one for you. Billionaires, finished or unfinished?
Billionaires are unfinished, but billionaires are at risk of becoming extinct because the inequality we see in our society today, where some 50 to 60 billionaires, wealthiest people, have the aggregate wealth of more than one half of the bottom 50% of the American population, is unsustainable. It's anti democratic and it is harmful to capitalism. So, we in this country have a crisis of inequality, and the proliferation of so many billionaires is a manifestation of that crisis. So, I worry that we will be asphyxiated by the accumulation of so much wealth held by so few people, that indeed our democracy will be asphyxiated because people will become increasingly hopeless. And I believe that while a pandemic is certainly a great threat to our democracy, the greatest threat of all to the American democracy is not a pandemic, it is hopelessness.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a great point. Something like 70% of the world's population this year alone, there's been more equality created. So this is not getting better. This is actually getting worse by the year. And to your point about the system and democracy, my favorite quote in democracy, that democracy needs to be more than two wolves and one lamb voting on what to have for dinner. So to me, that really is like, it has to work for all of us or democracy starts to fall down. And so I agree with you. I think this inequality, we need to address it. And by the way, I think that businesses have a responsibility to start by taking care of their own employees. And so maybe we can talk about that later. But I do think we are all in this together and we can't abdicate responsibility to either government or nonprofits or businesses. We all need to be in this together.
We need more CEOs like you. And speaking of CEOs and responsibilities, as the leader of a public company, I bet you have a point of view about my next question. Quarterly reports, finished or unfinished?
There's a lot of debate around this, but I'm going to say unfinished. Why am I going to say unfinished? First of all, the quarterly report has a lot to not like about it. I mean, because in many ways it creates this focus on short-term thinking as opposed to long-term thinking. But the truth of the matter is, I actually think the quarterly report is a good thing because say we decided that we were going to do annual reports or reports every 6 months. Investors are going to draw a line anyway And now, you don't have a chance to update them on how the business is doing. So I think quarterly reports are actually a good thing to update your investors. What I do think, though, is really important is that CEOs have the courage and conviction to think in a long-term fashion, to assure that their companies are moving from good companies to great companies over the medium to long term. And that, very importantly, this is not about maximizing profitability for next quarter, but it's really thinking about the environment that we all live in. Like, companies live in our communities, we live in the world, our employees are crucial parts of their communities. If we don't treat them well, then they don't have as much buying power, then they are disillusioned. And so I think this idea of thinking about multi-stakeholder capitalism is crucial. And one last thing I'll say, Darren, is this idea that having a purpose as a company and being more long-term focused is not at odds with being a profitable company that over the medium term gives higher returns to shareholders than those that are short-term focused. And so I think there's a lot of unfinished business, but it comes in terms of conviction and courage in terms of the quarterly report. Okay, so let me now go to you. I love this one, by the way. So, Milton Friedman, finished or unfinished?
Finished. The nail is in the coffin. We must never return to the ideology of Milton Friedman, because this idea of social responsibility by a corporation being a subversive idea was itself a subversive idea. And the ideology spawned by Friedman and that essay 50 years ago has done more harm to our society than the harm done by any economic theory, in my view. Friedman, coupled with another person who did harm, Ayn Rand, the cult of the individual and the idea of Friedman, the role and responsibility of the firm is only to make money for shareholders, together unleashed an unprecedented era of selfishness and greed. Ayn Rand once said that altruism was a disease. The idea that one could be generous, could think about community as a perverse idea, and that she could be admired by leaders in the corporate community, by leaders in government, is something that I deeply, profoundly regret, because we are seeing today the results of the Friedman ideology. And I want to be clear, Milton Friedman was not a bad person. This is not a personal attack, but he put in place the intellectual architecture that every other idea got hung on. And then our business schools produced generations of business leaders who viewed their work as simply maximizing shareholder value. I think this has been an incredible disservice to our society and to capitalism.
I think that's exactly right. I actually think that you maximize shareholder profitability in the short term by doing things like reducing salaries or paying minimum wages that are barely living wages. It affects communities, it affects our economies. Ultimately, I believe over the medium term, not even the long term, the medium term, it actually takes away from shareholder value because it takes away from the ability of our communities and citizens to be productive citizens. And you can't have people struggling every single day and expect them to not rail against the system, to not uprise against the system because things aren't working. And as businesses, we are part of the whole. And so I think we're in an era now. I think you'll be glad to hear this, Darren, of reverse Friedmanism, and hopefully that will be the way going forward.
I hope you are right. So, Dan, as one of the most fashionable CEOs in Silicon Valley, let me ask you the following: neckties, finished or unfinished?
So finished. I mean, they should have been
No,
out.
no, they can't be finished. What does this
Oh,
mean for Hermes?
yes. Well, I feel bad for him as well. Okay, let's think about this. When were neckties first really put into fashion? So I think it was King Louis the 13th in the 17th century that saw these Croatian mercenaries with this thing on their neck, and he thought, wow, those are really decorative. I'm going to require them for all royal gatherings going forward. And so think about that. Something that happened by the King of France in the 17th century that made you look more formal and part of royalty has existed with us through all of these generations going forward. And it's really actually amazing to me that that's happened. That, in many ways, they say that, clothes make the person. And I completely disagree with that. I think it's actually the person that makes the person. And it's been interesting. I've been in places that are more formal, like Washington, et cetera, and where I'm not in the, corporate uniform of a suit and neckties. And I can see sometimes people like give that look, that sort of askance look, but eventually they listen to the person and listen to the words coming out. And then they stop looking at what you're wearing and listen to what you're saying. And I think that's just a great example. My dad always said, we're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them proportionately. And so I think this idea of having to wear a suit to convey who you are, as opposed to the thoughts that you have, I think is very antiquated. And I think especially now in this sort of video conferencing era we're in, it's really gotten informal. I hope it never goes back to it. All right, so let me go to you. Now I'm going to give you asked me about neckties, so I'm going to ask you this one. Black tie, is it finished or unfinished?
Unfinished. We are never giving up on the black tie. And let me tell you why. Because there is something to be said for being lifted up by the clothing we wear. And there is something to be said for acknowledging the specialness of an occasion, circumstance, a celebration. And so I hope that we, in the post COVID world, don't throw out our black ties. I have to also say that, for many of us who grew up poor, who grew up black in the South, where black people only wore black tie as waiters, as domestics, to have the freedom to wear black tie as a guest on your own terms, in your own home, that there is something also quite uplifting about that. I know there are a lot of guys out in your part of the world who hate black tie, probably you too, Dan.
I
But
do.
I'm telling you, there is absolutely at least one occasion in your future for a black tie. So please don't throw yours out just yet. It is not finished.
Well, you know, that's a beautiful answer. I would have said finished, but I love your answer.
Dan, credit scores, finished or unfinished?
So I'm going to say finished. The reason I'm going to say finished on credit scores is I think it's an antiquated way of measuring somebody's credit worthiness. Credit scores only look at certain transactions. They don't look at your entire history of transactions as an individual. And I think they, as a result, they don't look at, like, for instance, rent payments, or people who don't have credit can't even get a credit score or have a thin file and then are pushed down in terms of their credit worthiness. I think this is a antiquated way of looking at somebody. I think today, with all the data and information we have, we ought to be using that in models that allow us to give more credit, working capital, to those who most deserve it, without being trapped by what was credit scores, and really looking about what could be in this immense amount of data that we have. And we're doing that in PayPal, and we've opened up the ability to lend to neighborhoods where 10 or more banks have left. And those are neighborhoods where the median income is below the national average. And so we disproportionately lend to Black-owned businesses, to women-owned businesses. And by the way, here's the great thing, Darren, when we lend to those businesses, their average sales go up by 22%. So these are businesses on Main Street that desperately need that working capital. And when they get it, they put it to work and their sales go up.
I love it. And I think you guys are on to something. The future is not the traditional credit score. And I love that you're innovating and helping to provide solutions that will serve more people who have historically been left out of the financial services marketplace.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right. Back to you, Darren. Reparations, finished or unfinished?
Unfinished. America has work to do to reckon with our racial past, our racial caste system in this country that has extracted from African Americans for over 400 years an economic bounty that has not redounded to our benefit. And so I believe the time has come for a serious conversation about reparations. That doesn't necessarily mean writing a check to every Black household in America. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about a recognition of the inputs of Black labor that was free, that has accreted over centuries to the benefit of white Americans. And today, the Black-white household wealth gap is in part a result of that historic racialized caste system in America.
Yeah. You know, I spent a lot of time with our Black employees and Black leaders across the country after the George Floyd killing. You know, because the amount of emotion that was unleashed, really also determination, some hopelessness. I mean, it was really, I was really deeply affected by the amount of emotion. And one of the things that, you know, I heard is that, and then I went and looked at it, is that the racial wealth gap is the same today as it was back in the 1960s, the last civil rights movement. And it's why PayPal decided to do a $530 million commitment to help Black and minority-owned businesses, not just in the short term, but over the long term as well. Because I think, to your point, this needs to be so much more than a moment and really a movement against racism in all of its forms. And so I think this is such unfinished business and will be with us for quite some time to come.
So, Dan, the social contract, finished or unfinished?
Clearly unfinished, clearly unfinished, and maybe worse than it has been for quite some time. Um, I think this idea, if you work hard, you'll get ahead, that the government will take care of you in some ways, Social Security, um, Medicare. I think in many ways that has been um, fractured. And you're seeing people in desperate need, and not just the what you might consider the poor, but I would argue the new middle class as well. That this is about the majority of America, not the minority of America. And so I think this social contract has a tremendous amount of work yet ahead of us. And I will say this is an area where CEOs, where businesses need to step up. We need to step up and take care of our employees. We need to step up and say that the problems that face us as a society cannot be the domain of someone else, of government, of nonprofits. This is a place where we need to take moral responsibility, take care of our employees, make sure they have a social net, make sure that they are paid fairly, that they have enough net disposable income to save and to think about their own dreams and the dreams of their children as well. And so I think we are very far from finished on this. And I think the encouraging part is I think we can do something about it.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dan.
Okay, last one, Darren, for us. Privilege, finished or unfinished?
Unfinished, because there will always be privilege in a society that is capitalist, a society that is democratic, because there will be talent, there will be skills and capacity that render certain professions, certain people in circumstances of privilege. But what we have today is a kind of privilege that is very harmful in our society, that is consistent with the kind of growing inequality. My question for all of us with privilege is not what are you willing to give back, but what are you willing to give up? That is the question for privileged, wealthy, advantaged Americans in October of 2020.
Yeah, such a good, provocative answer. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, Darren, we have two more questions that we are going to ask each other the same thing. So, in your own life, what is still either finished or unfinished for you?
What is unfinished for me is the realization of the idea of justice for all. America has, as a nation, not lived up fully to that idea. So I am inspired and reminded of my favorite poet, Langston Hughes, and his poem, Let America Be America Again, in which he says, let America be America again. America never was America to me. But he ends by saying, and yet someday America will be. And what he was saying was that while he was angry that justice had not been served during his lifetime, that he was hopeful that in the future justice would be rendered for all in America. So I am inspired every day by the unfinished work we have to do in this country around justice. So tell me, Dan, for you, what is the unfinished work in your life?
So I really don't want to follow that answer because it was such an inspiring one. But I do martial arts. That's something that I've done for a long, long time. And one of the things that I've found from martial arts is this sense of no matter how much you know so little. And it doesn't matter how skilled you are, there's so much more to learn. And it fills you um, with humility, a lot of humility. And like to me, this is what is so unfinished is all of us have so much more potential to learn, to not to think that we know all, but to learn and to take those learnings and maybe make some difference in the world with that. And it inspires me to keep growing, to keep learning, to keep listening, and to hopefully use those in productive ways.
Thank you, Dan, for this conversation. This finished, unfinished conversation with you has been a tremendous privilege for me. Thank you very much, Dan.
And Darren, thank you so much for me as well.